Hello and welcome to another episode of Intentionally Act Live. This is your host, Enrico E. Manalo, and I'm joined today by my very special guest, author and naturalist, Carl Safina. Carl Safina is the author of a number of books, including Beyond Words, as well as his latest book, Becoming Wild: How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace. So I picked up this book a few months ago, right when the pandemic was still really kind of raging. And one of the things that kind of inspired me to read it was I had read an article that was talking about some of the animals that were starting to appear in urban spaces as people were kind of staying inside. And I'd really been on an audiobook kick. I was living in a tiny studio apartment, and I really think that listening to all those audiobooks kind of helped me to expand my mind, but also to just stay kind of sane. So the show is really special to me for another reason, is that, well, as you'll hear in a few moments, Carl has a very reassuring voice. And so it was a real pleasure to hear him read this book and just to kind of to explore all the content. Um, my background is in conflict resolution, so I'm always thinking about peace, and my background is in the arts as well, and so beauty and peace like deeply appeal to me. So Carl, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great today. Today is World Oceans Day, and that's why I'm wearing a shirt with all sorts of deep sea creatures on it. I'm actually at the Norwalk Aquarium in Connecticut, where I'm going to be giving two talks later today. And it's a beautiful day here on the East Coast. We had a nice ferry ride over here.
I hear it's really hot in the Northeast right now. Is that so?
Yeah, 90 Fahrenheit today. Yeah.
Okay. Well, at least the I hope inside the aquarium is cool.
Yes, it is. Yeah, especially if you fall into one of the tanks.
Well, hopefully that won't happen to you, but if it makes for a good talk, then maybe it's for the best. So I'm really interested in kind of cracking into the subtitle of the book a little bit. So what is it that made you kind of start thinking about the lives of animals, beauty, peace, and how and culture? You know, like what was it that kind of started that seed for you?
You're asking for my entire biography.
I guess a nutshell one.
I I started being interested in the lives of animals when I was a small child, and I worked studying animals for about 15 years, studying seabirds mostly, um, and then I worked on ocean conservation issues, and then I began writing books about animals of the ocean, books about people of the ocean, how the changes that we're causing affect both animals and people who rely on the ocean for their lives. And then the last few books, I've circled back to my original interest, really, which is what do animals do and why do they do it? And the last two books are really focused on that. Beyond Words is about animal. When I say animal, I mean non-human animals, the way we normally think of them, about their emotional capacity and their mental capacities. And then what I guess has brought us together is the book Becoming Wild, which is about culture in non-human animals.
Yeah, so there might be people watching who are kind of wondering, well, what does advancing racial equity, anti-racism, diversity, what do these things have to do with animals, the lives of animals? Some people might further be kind of surprised to hear that animals have cultures, which you talk about in the book. So for those who are kind of know the word culture, but maybe haven't focused so much on what it means, cultures are really ways of transmitting ideas across generations. Like there's the American culture, of course, there's the culture of families, certainly, and it's kind of in this frame that you're talking about cultures among animals. This show is primarily about advancing racial equity, and our focus is mostly on the interrelationship between human lives and human concerns and how we ultimately treat one another. But if we're thinking about things from a more ecological perspective, why is it so important for humans to understand that interrelationship between us and lives that are not us?
It gives us perspective, for one thing. It helps us to understand where our impulses come from. And often I think you can look at and consider what non-humans do in a way that doesn't have the baggage of looking at what humans do. And, sort of the biases and blinders that people bring to the study of humans. We bring different biases and blinders to the study of non-humans, but in another way, we're a little more open to looking at them and bringing some of the themes across, I think.
So for you, was there kind of an inciting incident that kind of clued you into the fact that this was the case?
No. I mean, since I've been really interested in other animals since I was about 3 years old, it's just all built very, very gradually over time from experience to experience and insight to insight and, broadening perspective. Um, I don't even, I decided to write a book on culture and non-humans um, after my last book, which had been about capacities of cognition and emotion. And I don't even really quite remember the evolution of my thinking that made me decide to write a book about culture, because everything along those lines just sort of comes gradually with reading and thinking about things and seeing. I know that there were some cultural things included in that other book, and there were some things that I learned that were new, and I thought, well, I think there's enough here that warrants a whole separate different book about new thinking about what culture is, what culture isn't. Is it only a human thing? Do other animals have it? Which other animals have it? And then I thought, that's very worthy fuel for a new book. So no, not one sudden light bulb. My mind doesn't seem to work that way exactly, usually anyway.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear, because I noticed while reading your book that it seems as if there are a lot of strands from many different areas of thought that are being kind of woven together.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
true.
I mean, I feel like my mind works that way as well, although I tend to be rather messy about it. So I always admire when somebody's able to weave strands together particularly well. And I just kind of wonder, like, I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about animals, studying animals, talking about animals. But are there kind of what other streams are flowing into your brain? Like, what are you soaking up?
Well, I also read the news and I know what's going on with people, and I wonder why some of these things that are going on with people are going on, and on the negative side of the news, why a lot of these things are still going on, because a lot of the negative news is stuff that has been a problem for centuries. So that's in there also, and I think that it's very important to look at other animals just as they are, to learn about them. But it's impossible to learn about them without broadening your perspective on what people are like and why they're like that and what they do. Because humans are animals, and we're very cultural animals. We have a lot of layers that we've added on top of our basic biology, but We are still mainly ruled by our basic biology, and I think that studying other animals, definitely provides great insight into that part of it.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that's been in the news on and off for the past few years has been about human resilience. All right, so we talk a lot about how there's a natural disaster and people are resilient; they can bounce back from that. People can experience oppression in various forms, racism, sexism, what have you, and under certain conditions, they can overcome these things. But one of the things that we don't hear about, we hear about the environment a lot, but we don't hear about the resilience of animals, which you kind of talk about in your book as well, noting that one of the things that are maybe not as resilient are cultures. So when cultures are kind of eroded, I think is one of the words that you use, then this transmission of information over time gets lost, and that can be a very fragile thing. So I guess I'm really curious about, like, if we're thinking about resilience as a theme, what is it that humans can be learning from non-humans that can benefit us both in terms of resilience?
That's an excellent question. I don't think it has a simple answer because I think there are different answers, and they overlap, and some of them go in opposite sorts of directions. So let me just try to take a crack at that. When we think about culture, we say, oh, culture is sports and religion and technology and things like that. That's not culture. That's the products of culture.
Mm-hmm.
We never ask ourselves what culture is and why does it exist? Why are there different cultures in humans? You don't even think that that's a question. It never occurs to people.
Yeah.
But if you study non-humans, it starts to occur to you almost immediately, because the question becomes, why are there different cultures in certain species? Chimpanzees have several cultures. Some birds have several cultures. Some whales have several cultures. Why? Why don't they just all have the same culture? There are a lot of species that have no culture. There's a lot of species that just basically have one culture. Why do some have different cultures? Why do people have so many? So culture is the thing that you learn that is socially transmitted. It's not just what you learn by yourself by trial and error,
Right.
what you learn from others, and that is passed along socially. That's what culture is. Why do we have it? Because it answers the question, and the question is, how do we live here? Some culture is totally arbitrary. We live here just because it's developed this way. Some culture is place-based. We live here because this is a coastal place. We live here because it's the desert. That's how we live here. We live in the desert in a certain way because it's the desert. But other cultures, it's just arbitrary why we live that way. The thing is, though, when you learn how to live, that's how you know how to live. So if you grow up in the Amazon rainforest and you know where there are certain kinds of things to eat, certain fruits and certain nuts, and you know dozens of species of things that are usable, and you can hunt birds and monkeys with a blowpipe, you can do that.
Right.
If you grow up in the Arctic and you need to know how to make a net to catch salmon and how to hunt seals with a harpoon, you can do that. But if you're from the Arctic and you suddenly get dumped into the Amazon rainforest, you will die. And if you're from the rainforest and you suddenly are abandoned in the Arctic, you will die. That's because your culture answers a question, how do we live here? And that's true for other animals as well. You can't just move them around and expect that they'll do okay. You can't just wipe out a population and expect that you can just bring more animals in and dump them there, because that has been done a lot. And those species which are reliant on culture, and a lot of them people didn't know they were reliant on culture. It's just like abandoning a dog. They call it a reintroduction program. Those animals have no idea where they are, what they're supposed to do there, where they go when the weather turns bad and winter comes, and they die like crazy. That's because the local culture has been shattered and doesn't exist anymore. And the new ones don't know the answer to the question, how do we live here? But if you take it from humans, there are hundreds of human cultures that have been lost, especially since Europeans started to roam around the world, wreaking havoc, basically. And cultures are often lost non-violently, just by sort of assimilation, and because the context of the culture erodes, and you can't support a hunting culture if there's not enough room for it. All those kinds of problems can happen. So in a sense, it works in non-humans in one way, and in another sense, it works in humans in the same way. Lethal pressures, loss of the space that you used to live in, and then non-humans adapt to human pressures sometimes. Sometimes they go extinct.
Yeah.
If they're highly specialized animals and they don't have a lot of latitude, they'll go extinct. If they have a lot of latitude, like coyotes, they'll live anywhere. I mean, I saw a coyote under the Hollywood sign one time. They live in Chicago. They live in the Bronx, New York. They're unbelievably adaptive animals. And many birds. There are birds that are common in my neighborhood that when I was a kid did not live around people. Where people moved, they couldn't handle it. But they've learned over generations that they can live a little closer, or they can adapt to different ways of foraging, or what counts as food in a neighborhood with garbage pails is different than what counts as food on a coastline,
I mean, that's so interesting to think of animals as being vulnerable to culture shock, which we almost exclusively talk about in humans. When I was in my 20s, I lived in Vietnam for about 5 years. And even though I was fairly well traveled at that point, after living in Vietnam, what I realized is that I actually never got over the culture shock. Like, I had not fully adapted to operate within the local culture there. And just kind of reflecting on it, there were so many unforeseen things that jumped out at me when I thought that I had adapted well to living there, that let me know, like, nope, you still don't have a handle on this. Like, just given the complexity of the natural world, I can only imagine what that must be like for one species who developed in one part of the world to just be dumped off, as you say, somewhere else. And with humans, we have so much support and ways of communicating with each other that can help us to mitigate that. But with animals, I imagine that's almost not the case, which leads to kind of, I don't know if it's sink or swim or what have you, but it's certainly an adaptation challenge.
Yeah, well, I think anything with anything that's alive it exists on a whole range, So there are some species where once you learn what to do, that's it. And if things change, you're completely out of luck. And others are a little bit more adaptable, maybe a little bit more tuned into and able to assimilate in a new social group. And humans, I would say, are in the latter category. When you go to a different culture as a child, you're still really in the learning phase, and you can soak it up a lot more. Your accent changes. You just become, the children of immigrants who come to America have a good shot at being Americanized. But my relatives who came from Sicily, many of them lived in Brooklyn, New York for 40 years and did not learn how to have a conversation in English. They brought a culture and they did not adapt to the new surroundings, really. They just erected a little fortress, which we kind of call a ghetto. I mean, a ghetto has a negative connotation as a slum, but what a ghetto really is, is a little enclave of culture.
Yeah.
And that's how they lived. They read an Italian language newspaper and they talked to their friends in Italian, and they didn't go anywhere, and that was that. And it's that way with other species to a certain extent, and our species is that way to a certain extent.
Yeah, I remember I studied ethnic enclaves a bit in grad school, and one of the things that I was really surprised about was that when people kind of get trapped in those ethnic enclaves, like they can't leave because, like if we use Chinatown as an example, there are many Chinatowns in the U.S. where there are American citizens who are born, but they grow up speaking various Chinese languages. They never leave their community, and they kind of get stuck there. And so they're not able to adapt further. What it seems like we're talking about is that from animals, we can learn to kind of get unstuck from our human BS, if you will, by drawing parallels, by not introducing all of that baggage that you mentioned in some cases.
I think it helps us to see the stuckness. It helps us to understand kind of what's going on and why. So instead of saying, "Oh, my dopey relatives never learned English," you kind of understand that culture is what you learn when you're small. It's hard to change if you move to a different location, and you can understand a little bit better. And if you understand a little bit better, you can take whatever steps, offer whatever services might address that with understanding.
Yeah.
And so that's another way that I think it's beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, just reflecting on something you said before about culture is how we have learned to live in a certain context. It strikes me as ironic that I'm here doing a show about anti-racism and advancing racial equity, when the reality is there would be no need for this kind of show if we hadn't adapted to live in America in a racist and oppressive way. And another thing.
And remember that racism is part of our culture anyway.
Yeah.
There's a question, and there's a little bit of a conversation debate that I've been in as to whether racism is instinctive in people or not. And I think there's actually a lot of evidence both ways.
Yeah.
When I say instinctive, I mean, I think it's very, very clear that for small children, you're simply not born racist. You need to learn racism. But the question is, are all cultures xenophobic, or do some welcome outsiders and people who are different? And actually, there are a lot that are xenophobic and a lot that are welcoming as basic attributes of their culture. The American experience is mixed, but I would say that more than not, newcomers are not embraced right away anyway, and sometimes they're not embraced for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned your relatives that lived in Brooklyn for a long time, and it's easy for a lot of people to forget that many Italian immigrants were not welcomed in the U.S. With any great warmth.
No, I have a friend who's 90 years old now, and he remembers the 1930s, and he was telling me about some Italian friends he had, and he told me that they were treated terribly, really terribly. And I never saw that. I heard a little bit about it, but he was telling me in a lot more detail about how they were not at all welcomed or accepted, and treated very badly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of what we're talking about is broadening our kind of our way of thinking about things. And certainly looking into our own history can be very helpful in that regard. One thing that on the theme of stuckness, that I was thinking about as we were chatting is that humans are very kind of stuck on our own importance. So that could be our ethnic group. So in the US, there's that strain of being stuck on Anglo-Saxon kind of identity as being the pinnacle of American culture, right? That's what people aspire to, that kind of image. But more broadly speaking, people tend to think of themselves as most important. To your point earlier about whether or not people are born racist, my background is in conflict resolution. And one of the most jarring things that I keep coming back to is, and this was kind of done in an experiment called the Robber's Cave, which used children as their test subjects. No children were harmed, thankfully. Um, but when groups see each other, when they meet each other, if you introduce an element of competition for scarce resources, that is enough to motivate conflict. And this effect is so strong that the other group doesn't even have to be real. Even the suggestion of the other group is enough to motivate conflict. So to your point about cultures who are like more welcoming versus less welcoming, I'm always been very curious about how that dynamic that I'm talking about kind of plays into that.
Well, there again, I think, learning about other animals is informative and enlightening, because you use the phrase competition over scarce resources, and that is basically the driver of biological evolution. If there's not scarce resources and there's not competition, you get very slow or no evolution. If there's a lot of competition, you are much more likely to get new species as a result, or one species driving another to local extinction, or over a great amount of time to total extinction, perhaps. So, that again is not just a thing that operates in the human mind. That's something that the human mind inherited as a survival mechanism, and a lot of the point of trying to understand how deep these impulses are is to understand how to overcome the worst of them, because we have a shot at doing that. Why is that a good thing? Because it would alleviate the misery that is inflicted on people, on innocent people, and other creatures really do not have the ability to ask those questions or to do anything about it. That I think is a uniquely human thing, and if we want to congratulate ourselves over how clever we are, maybe we should use our ability to understand things, ask questions, and alleviate suffering.
I mean, I would absolutely love to see that. And I guess my question now is, how do we kind of get unstuck from ourselves? How do we, not only make room for other human lives to exist with full dignity, but if we extend those lines just a bit further, are there, in the course of your work, have you seen things that could kind of help us to understand why it's so important to extend the lines to non-human lives as well?
Well, the importance is that this is the world, and there is not a good reason to basically wreck the planet that supports all of life, or to, greet these creatures that have been here for many millions of years and just decide our generation doesn't think you have any value, so we're going to let you go or make you go extinct. There's no wisdom tradition or religion that teaches that harming the world is a good thing. Where there are wisdom traditions that teach that our responsibility is to heal the world, or to pass along a world that is at least as good and maybe better than we got it. That's how people have thought over thousands of years. It's not the way we think right now. We're in an exceptionally destructive phase. So that's part of it. But another part of it is sometimes people say, well, why should we care about animals when people have so much uh, trouble and people are so nasty to people? Well, if people were a lot less nasty to animals, they would be a lot less nasty to other people. You know, nastiness is nastiness, and cruelty is cruelty, and empathy is empathy. So a good place to practice empathy is on other creatures first. If you teach a child that cruelty is okay, they are much more likely to be cruel as adults. And this has been shown in lots and lots of studies. You know that often real psychopaths have a history of physically abusing and torturing other animals before they, you know, get the gumption up to do something horrible to some people. So there's that as well, and you know, those are huge reasons.
You know, this is going to sound, I hope that nobody takes this the wrong way, but I have a dog. His name is Chunk. Uh, I've been shocked at how much I've learned about empathy and in resolving conflicts, frankly, from just living with him. You know, he can't communicate with me in the same way that I communicate with him. And so I find that I have to be a lot more intentional about my actions, and I have to try to be really clear in my communications with him. And that's involved not just the verbal aspect, but just my way of kind of being in a space with him. And I use the lessons I learned from him all the time. Like I facilitate workshops and groups, and I do coaching and these kinds of things. And what I've noticed is it's a lot easier for me to be empathetic with Chunk than it is for me to be with most people. But having that background, once I'm in a space with a person, then I find that I'm much more open and ready to do that. I don't know if you found, I know you're mostly working with wild animals, but I don't know if that's something that you've also found.
We have three dogs. I 10 or 12 years ago, I was not really a dog person, and I've become one, and I cannot believe how much I love those dogs and really how incredible dogs are. But I'm going to say two things. One is to note that you prefaced that last set of comments by saying, I hope nobody takes this wrong. Now, why do you have to feel like you need to apologize for saying that you've learned about empathy from your dog? So just think about that. Don't answer, but just think about that. And dogs are the people that we aspire to be.
100%.
They they have an incredible amount of empathy. They're very, very loyal. They are very forgiving. They always want to smooth over and erase any kind of problem or tension that has occurred. And they're very protective when they need to be, or they feel like you are threatened or they are threatened. So empathy, loyalty, forgiveness, protection, they have it all. And if we could be like that all the time, we'd be a lot better humans.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I wonder for you, just like in saying that, in your book, Becoming Wild, you talk about beauty a fair deal. To me, all those things that you mentioned are firmly in the beautiful. Those are things that I love. Those are things that I'm attracted to. Um, so I wonder if you can kind of go through what you mean when you talk about beauty in your book for our audience, so we can kind of make that connection.
Well, that's a big topic, and it's a little bit complicated, but it's got several phases to it. So let me just try.
Okay.
One thing is that if you look at the physical beauty of animals, and birds are a really good example of this because they're the most visible, and because they happen to be also a really good example of it. You see a lot of ornamentation on them, showy feathers, bright colors, color patterns that really do not have any practical value, and actually are impractical. They're impractical to grow. They make you a little bit more obvious to predators and a little bit more vulnerable. Why are they there? The answer is they're there because during courtship, the choices that a prospective mate is making, and usually with birds, females choose males, and males are just trying to find a mate, but the females are the choosy ones who are picking a mate. Females want males who have these beautiful attributes, these particular colors, these particular plumes, singing really, really well. And if you don't have that, you are not likely to be chosen. And over a very, very long time, that's why we have most of the physical beauty that we have today. Flowers are there to attract pollinators. That's the only reason flowers exist. If it wasn't for pollinators, we'd have other ways that plants would be producing. They would just somehow set seeds, or be wind pollinated, or have spores or something like that. But showy flowers are there only to attract pollinators. Now, a really weird thing is they have to tangle the nervous system of the pollinator. The pollinator has to see that as attractive to go to it. And what do? They do it with sight. They look a certain way, and scent. Flowers smell a certain way. And they're all advertising. And by the way, all of this has to do with competition for scarce resources. Both of these things we're talking about. Now, a thing that I think is kind of almost mystical is, why is it that something that is built to attract birds or built to attract pollinators appears beautiful to us? We're not birds, we're not pollinators. We did not evolve from birds, and we did not evolve from pollinators. So why does it look beautiful to us? And why do we see the whole world as basically very beautiful? If you look at most people's favorite colors, they'll either say it's blue or it's green. They won't say some obscure little rare color. Most people's favorite colors are the two most dominant colors of the world. And I think that the reason that we see the world as beautiful, and we see, a starry night as beautiful, or birds singing, or the scent of flowers, is that it's hard to stay alive. And our brain motivates us to stay alive by having a capacity that says, this thing is beautiful, that thing is beautiful. It makes us feel really good. Beauty is not a property of a thing. A bird's feather is just a bird's feather. If you think it's beautiful, that's because your brain is telling you the way that looks is beautiful, and that sense of beauty makes you feel something. It makes you feel, that's nice, right? So it may be, and I say this only based on logic and not based on evidence, but it may be that our capacity, the reason our brain is capable of seeing anything as beautiful, is that beauty saves us. Beauty makes being alive worth all of the effort it takes for us to just stay in the game, because it's our reward for being alive. To just say the sky is beautiful, these trees are beautiful, this is a beautiful day. If we had no aesthetic sense and we still had to struggle and do everything it takes to stay alive, I'm not sure it would feel like it would be worth it. So I think beauty saves us.
Yeah, I mean, I love that so much. And I guess as much as that does deeply resonate with me, it also kind of provokes a question, right? There are so many things that we consider to be ugly in the world. And so many of these things that we think of as ugly are things that we have of our own design, of our own engineering, right? Motivated by our own needs, motivated by the practical, right? We often see beauty as being dismissed very easily, if not out of hand. And so I wonder where your thinking is on this. Like, how is it that our reward for being alive is the beauty of the world, and we end up doing some pretty ugly stuff to each other.
Because what comes to us automatically is mostly stuff we're not aware of. That's true psychologically as well as bodily. So if you use the bodily for an example, most of what happens in our body we have no awareness of.
Yeah.
Everything about our cell functioning, our digestion, our blood supply, our healing process, gestation, all of this happens without us thinking about it, directing it, or anything. And we're aware of only a very small fraction of anything about our lives, basically. And I think that a thing is beautiful, or a thing is good. A thing is good if it adds beauty and compassion to the world. And I think it's bad if it adds ugliness and pain. Now, what counts as those things is a little bit arbitrary. People might disagree, but I'll stick with those as guiding definitions.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And so I guess, other questions that I have are related to peace, right? So, oh, you're muted, Carl.
I'm just telling somebody in the room that I forgot to plug my computer in and I need to get my power cord going. So
okay.
I was just listening to you, though.
All right. So sorry about that. I was just curious about peace, right? So we talked about beauty a little bit. We've talked about culture, and then this peace piece of your book, right?
Right.
So if we are unaware of a lot of things, right? So we often see that people who have the least awareness of the power that diversity can have on their lives, the diversity of ideas, the diversity of methods, the diversity of people, of course, the diversity of any number of things. When people get locked into a certain way of thinking, they become very obstinate and often very hostile, right? So I'm very curious about this concept of peace and how that concept of peace developed for you in the writing of this book.
Well, that had a lot to do with chimpanzees, and probably a lot of people know, and this is another thing about just, I'm an ecologist, and ecology is entirely the study of relationships. Some people are human ecologists. They mostly study the relationships among people and between people and their environment. I'm an ecologist who's mostly natural ecology, landscapes, living things, and that sort of thing. But many people know very little about the diversity of nature. And the more you learn about the diversity of nature by studying nature, the more completely impressive it gets. That part never gets old. It's new and renewed, mind-bogglingly all the time. And if you live to be 10,000 years old, you'd still be learning. So that is a phenomenal aspect of being an ecologist. Now, a lot of people have heard that chimpanzees are our closest relative.
Yeah.
That's only partly true. There's another species called the bonobo, which is equally close to us. We basically all split from a common ancestor at the same time. Humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees developed different ways of coping with something inevitable if you live in a group. If you live in a group, strife and conflict is inevitable. Chimpanzees have a society that creates a lot of strife and conflict because males are very, very driven to achieve high status and rank, and only one of them can be at the top at one time.
The Highlander model.
So there's a lot of stress that gets created. But to keep the group from falling apart, because there are a lot of benefits to having a group, there also have to be capacities for dealing with the stress, alleviating the conflict, basically having forgiveness, or some sense of being allies and moving on. Bonobos, our other closest relative, is not male dominated, they are female dominated. Females do not achieve hierarchy and top status by competition and violence like chimpanzees do. In bonobos, females don't really care who's at the top. Females form groups of allies who suppress male tendencies toward violence and drama, which keeps the whole thing much more peaceful all the time. In chimpanzees murder other chimps on a fairly low but regular basis, like humans do. Mm-hmm. Chimpanzees might murder somebody they've known for 20 years, like humans do. Bonobos have never been known to kill another bonobo anywhere at any time at all. Chimpanzees, when they meet another group, they are afraid of that group and hostile toward that group. They either fight or they flee. Bonobos either greet the other group and frolic and mingle and very famously engage in orgies that reduce tension, or they just quietly go back into the core part of their territory. They are equally related to us. One has found a way to totally prevent the inevitable conflict that results from being in groups, and the other has found ways of getting past and avoiding the drama and conflict, but not until after it's happened. Mm-hmm. So, I think there's an awful lot to think about humans, which are kind of in the middle of that, kind of, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to streaming, one of the things that I'm doing is engaging in client work, organizational change. And I think what I'm sort of reflecting on as you and I are talking is perhaps one reason why people kind of tend to think of chimpanzees as our closest relatives, but not bonobos, is perhaps we can see ourselves in chimpanzee behavior much more clearly. And there are certainly implications for that we see within the workplace, often very hierarchical, often very male dominated. Perhaps not physical violence, but certainly a lot of psychological violence, emotional violence goes on within organizations, including a lot of dehumanization through oppressive forces like racism, like sexism, and these things. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, what it is that you think that humans could practically learn from bonobos. I think it's still too soon to pitch the engaging in orgies thing, especially so soon after the pandemic.
I went through that when I was young. It didn't really last.
Right. Okay, but other than the orgy thing, are there things that we can be kind of taking from examining chimps and bonobos? I know that, like, we're talking about relationships and kind of examining how alternatives or options for engaging in relationships with one another, like orgies or not. But yeah,
I think it shows that the male impulse toward domination is both ridiculous, arbitrary, and if you look at bonobos, totally unnecessary. Wolves are another interesting example as well. People, think this whole thing about alpha personalities and alpha males and things like that is total nonsense. It supposedly comes from the way that wolves act. The wolves do not act that way. A wolf pack is a nuclear family. It has two breeders, mom and dad, and their young of the last several seasons. And then as the young become adolescents, they leave, just like ours do. the male does not dominate the female. In fact, the female tends to make more of the decisions about when they're going to stop, when they're going to hunt, when they're going to move. The male and the female lead by example. They do not lead by dominating. They do not lead by dominance, by violence. They just lead by example because it's a quiet, self-assured confidence in their own competence. Often in our workplaces, the ones who are struggling for hierarchy do not have confidence in their competence, largely because a lot of the times they're totally incompetent and they're trying to hide it, right? So there's that. Also, if you look at other group living animals where females tend to be the most dominant, those are peaceful places where the dust ups are minor, quickly smoothed over, and there's not this arbitrary drive to who's going to be able to dominate the others. Often there's a need for decision making, and often there's a need for everybody in the group to basically follow the one who has made the decision, but usually that's because they have faith in their decision, because the leader has achieved, especially in female-dominated societies like, let's say, orca whales or lemurs or elephants. The females achieve the status of leader not by beating somebody, but because they're the oldest and they have the most practical knowledge. That in humans, we call that being an elder. If you look at indigenous cultures have leaders. They don't have bosses. Nobody gives anybody an order in an indigenous culture. Nobody gets punished in an indigenous culture. They respect their elders because the elders know what's going on from experience. It's not that humans have to be miserable, dominating, violent people who create suffering. That doesn't happen in most of the human cultures that have ever existed. Unfortunately, it happens in ours, and ours has gone global. And that's a terrible stroke of luck, in my opinion. It's just bad luck.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tension that I feel quite a lot, right? So born in the US, American citizen. There are, of course, many other cultures on Earth. I work in trying to bring equity to everybody, not bring, but to help people to work toward equity. And still, I see some things on the news and I find that impulse welling up inside me, like, oh, America's #1. And I know that dominating impulse is one of the things that is at the heart of so many of our problems. Just in quickly reflecting on what you and I have been chatting about, it really seems like a lot of what we can learn from animals are not only how we can be relating to one another, but how we can be relating with ourselves. So our relationships with who we are internally and having some sense of actually who we are, what we're good at, what we're not good at, can be helpful in relating to other people. And that could even help us to relate to non-human lives and to the greater ecology that we exist inside of.
Right. Well, one thing you can learn from culture in non-humans is that within a species there are different cultures. We've been talking as though it's either humans or some other animal, right? But if you take simply that and say, wait a second, actually in humans, there have been a lot of different cultures with major themes that lasted for many thousands of years that are very different from the way we think, we do things, because when we live in America, we just think this is the way we do things. And it is true. There are many things in our culture that are the way we do things. And there are many subcultures in America. But if you look at indigenous cultures, which share many, many traits wherever they are around the world, American indigenous culture, Asian indigenous culture, Australian indigenous culture, you see some very striking similarities. And one of them is that community is everything. That the most important thing is to figure out a way to contribute to the community, and that your sense of who you are as an individual and your importance as an individual derives from what you can bring to the well-being and betterment of the community.
Yeah.
And those things, I think, could be transferred even into a modern industrial society. We've brought a brutalization with us into the industrialization that happened in the last 200 years. I don't think it needed to be like that. I think indigenous cultures could have industrialized with those values, and I think industrial cultures could be run with those values. That the main question is, how do we all make things better for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd also just like to mention that many of the restorative justice practices that we have and have been continuing to develop are actually rooted in many of those indigenous cultures that you mentioned. And for those who, again, are not so familiar, we're talking restorative justice, so a model of justice where everybody feels satisfied by the outcome and people are made whole. That's in contrast to, say, litigation, which our culture practices, which is mostly about extracting material wealth from one another and not about preserving relationships at all. And I think we can kind of see the effects. Carl, you had something?
Yeah. I learned this by observing something when I was in high school, before I ever thought about any of these things we're talking about culture or indigenous anything. When I was in high school, I was a musician, and there were a lot of other people who played sports. And one of the things that I saw is that when you play sports, you win by making somebody lose.
Yeah.
When you play music, you win by making everybody win and contributing to something beautiful. That's a big difference, and I've tried to carry that with me through my whole life and continue to try to learn from that.
Yeah, I mean, I played music as a kid too, and there's just no better feeling when you all start to gel and it all just starts to flow. You know, like that's a magical place that I'm always trying to get back to. And, you know, ultimately, that's what I would love for our societies to do, to hit a kind of flow that's in harmony with the world that we inhabit. So in our last couple of minutes here, I think I'll ask you our kind of closing question, which is what would you love to see come out of your work? So not just the writing, but just everything that you're involved in.
Compassion and the elevation of the importance of beauty. You know, people say, oh, that's just aesthetics. Well, aesthetics are what make life worth living. And compassion is a beautiful thing. You know, every living thing, this is a thing that I learned from other animals, every living thing wants to stay alive and avoid pain. And if we could simply operate like that's what we would like to bring to each other and honor what's beautiful around us, it's not very complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I often feel like we make so many aspects of life more complicated than they need to be. And, you know, why we do that is there are many good reasons, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, it's going to be us that has to deal with those complications. So if we can get on the same page about being proactive about dealing with them, maybe we stand a much better shot than we do where we are right now. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Carl. The last thing I want to touch on is as we were preparing for the show, you mentioned that during the pandemic you'd made a friend named Alfie. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I'll just show a picture real quick. So this is you and Alfie. And I wonder if you could just quickly tell us about your relationship with this wonderful owl.
Oh, sure. Well, Alfie is a screech owl that had fallen out of a nest and was brought to a rehabilitator. The person who found her couldn't find where the nest was. Alfie was dying, was covered with fly eggs, which, if they hatched, the maggots would have eaten her alive.
Oh my God.
She was hours from dying. The rehabilitator brought her to health. We raised her. We released her in our backyard, and she decided to stay around. And she acquired a wild mate, and they have raised 2 broods of chicks in a nest box that I put up in the yard. And it's been a magical delight to have that relationship and to watch all of that happening.
Wow, wonderful. And you gave us this picture. Is this one of the broods of chicks, correct?
That's right. Those are 2 chicks from last year. Her new chicks just fledged a few days ago.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your relationship with Alfie with us, Carl. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being on our show. Thank you as well, everybody out there watching. This, again, is your host, Enrico E. Manalo, with another episode of Intentionally Acts Live. Till next time, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.